beneath the official history lies a darker ledger. Pages scrawled in vanished ink, sealed in vaults no one admits exist. Here, whispers replace facts, convoys without ports, couriers with invisible cargo, bunkers detonated before their secrets could breathe. These fragments suggest not a war of armies alone, but of shadows, where loyalty dissolved into hunger for knowledge, and silence was enforced at the muzzle of secrecy. To follow this trail is to trespass into the archives that were never meant to open. The documents sat sealed for nearly 5 decades inside a plain army green container, labeled only with the stenciled letters "Shafe Restricted." When the file was finally catalogued in the early 1990s, archivists noticed something unusual. While the label clearly referred to Operation Eclipse, the Allied plan for the occupation of Germany, many of the enclosed papers had been deliberately misfiled. Memos were stripped of signatures. Operational logs bore dates inconsistent with official histories, and entire pages were scorched at the edges, as if someone had attempted to destroy them before a hasty rescue. Taken together, these fragments paint a chilling picture. Operation Eclipse may have been about more than disarming Germany. It was also about extracting people, knowledge, and technology before anyone else could claim them. Officially, Operation Eclipse was drafted in late 1944 by the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHEF, as a blueprint for the partition and control of Germany following surrender. The plan detailed zones of occupation, disarmament measures, and the arrest of key Nazi officials. But among the papers locked in the so-called Black Vault were communications that suggest a parallel agenda. A December 18, 1944, memorandum, unsigned, but bearing the watermark of the British Foreign Office, outlined priority retrieval operations for scientific personnel assets of high strategic value. The targets were not just prominent figures such as Werner von Braun, but lesser-known engineers, physicists, and even psychiatrists working in institutes scattered across Bavaria, Saxony, and the Ruhr. The documents indicate that the Special Operations Executive, SOE, and British SIS had prepared covert teams tasked with penetrating deep into collapsing Wehrmacht-held areas ahead of advancing US and Soviet units. Codenamed Harvest Teams, these detachments moved under the cover of uniformed Allied divisions, but operated outside normal chains of command. Their task was simple: identify, seize, and extract. The files make particular mention of units infiltrating as early as March 1945 into Thuringia and Hesse, where intelligence suggested components of advanced V2 guidance systems were hidden. Testimonies from debriefed German prisoners noted crates being moved by SS technical branch personnel under cover of night, often accompanied by security detachments from the 505th Heavy Panzer Battalion. One report in the vault, marked Top, Secret, Most Immediate, describes a raid on April 2, 1945, near the town of Nordhausen. US Army records already confirm the liberation of the nearby Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp, where prisoners were forced to assemble V2 rockets. But the Scharf file details something absent from official accounts: the discovery of a reinforced chamber beneath the tunnels, housing blueprints and instruments relating to gyroscopic navigation. The report claims that British officers, not American, secured the materials within hours of the site's capture. The documents and surviving technicians were transferred to a forward-holding station under the authority of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's staff, bypassing US oversight entirely. Perhaps the most disturbing element of the Black Vault papers concerns the use of captured documents for psychological warfare. A May 1945 signal from SHEF Psychological Warfare Division to London's SIS headquarters references interrogation protocols applied to select German scientists, suggesting an effort to probe not only technical expertise, but also methods of coercion. Notes attached to the signal describe experiments conducted at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Psychiatry in Munich, where researchers had studied the breaking point of human cognition under duress. These findings, the notes indicate, were deemed of paramount interest for future Cold War intelligence operations. The secrecy surrounding these activities was absolute, Allied after-action reports from Operation Eclipse, presented to the public, dealt almost exclusively with the orderly transition of power, the arrest of Gestapo leaders, and the dismantling of German armaments. Nowhere was mention made of black site extractions or the transfer of German personnel into Allied custody for research purposes. When American officials later publicized Operation Paperclip, the program that brought German scientists into US service, the British role appeared marginal, yet the Black Vault papers suggest London had already conducted its own shadow version months earlier, removing assets and destroying traces long before the Americans formalized their operation. One memorandum, dated June 12, 1945, and bearing the initials of a high-ranking War Office official, illustrates the determination to obscure the record. It orders that all files pertaining to SOE Eclipse harvest teams be compartmentalized under unrelated categories, and that physical remnants of unauthorized seizures be destroyed. The language is unambiguous. Even within SHAF, knowledge of the extractions was to be buried. A handwritten note in the margin, presumably by an aide, adds, "Soviets are aware of missing materials. Their protests must be dismissed as propaganda." Cross-referencing these documents with Soviet archives released after 1991 produces an eerie corroboration. In June 1945, Moscow lodged formal complaints that Allied forces had absconded with German specialists in rocket propulsion from the Nordhausen sector, an area ostensibly allocated to Soviet control. At the time, Western officials ridiculed the claim as baseless, yet the Black Vault confirms the Soviets may have been right. The very individuals Stalin demanded, men like Helmut Gröttrup, a guidance engineer, appear on British seizure lists, dated weeks earlier. While some of these men eventually surfaced in Soviet custody, the chaotic overlap of extractions and defections makes it impossible to know exactly how many were spirited away by SIS before borders were sealed. The Vault papers end abruptly in August 1945, just weeks after Japan's surrender. The final entry, a terse cable marked Eclipse completed, states that remaining matters transferred to long-term strategic files. No further documentation has been located, and many historians believe the bulk of the files were either destroyed or locked into classified compartments that remain sealed today. What survives provides only a fractured glimpse into a shadow operation that paralleled the official occupation of Germany. Taken as a whole, the Black Vault suggests that Operation Eclipse was not simply about restoring order. It was about seizing knowledge before it could be lost, or worse, captured by rivals. The competing agendas of London, Washington, and Moscow converged in the ruins of the Reich, where shattered documents, stolen blueprints, and kidnapped scientists became the spoils of a new kind of war. For decades, the truth remained hidden, sanitized by official histories and redacted reports. But the fragments that slipped through, charred papers, unsigned memos, and misfiled cables testify to a darker reality. That even as World War II ended, the seeds of the Cold War had already been planted in secrecy, buried in the vaults of men determined to erase their own footprints. In the winter of 1945, the Baltic Sea became a graveyard. German civilians, retreating soldiers, and remnants of the Kriegsmarine crowded onto ships in what history books later called Operation Hannibal, the largest naval evacuation in history. Yet hidden beneath the chaos of this mass flight was another story, one that official records barely acknowledge. Among the endless flotillas that ferried refugees westward were vessels with no manifest, no civilian passengers, and no destination recorded in Kriegsmarine logs. They were known only by a code name whispered in intercepted radio traffic. Seeschlange, Sea Serpent. Their fate remains one of the enduring mysteries of the war's final months. The first trace of Seeschlange appears in an encrypted Enigma message dated January 17, 1945, decrypted weeks later by codebreakers at Bletchley Park. The message, routed through the Oberkommando der Marine, OKM, instructed the escort of high-value freight from Peenemünde to Gotenhafen, Peenemünde, already infamous as the birthplace of the V-2 rocket, was under direct threat from advancing Soviet forces. Allied bombers had reduced much of the complex to rubble months earlier, yet intelligence photographs showed renewed activity. Trains arriving at night, guarded convoys loading cargo onto flatbeds. What was being moved out could not have been simply machinery. The timing suggests that the Reich was evacuating its most sensitive projects before they fell into enemy hands. The Bletchley decrypt noted a convoy of 6 freighters, stripped of names and identification, scheduled to depart under Kriegsmarine escort through the heavily mined Baltic waters. The ships were listed not under Operation Hannibal, but under the special category Vorrang, priority transport. Their escort included U-boats from the 2nd U-boot flotille, redeployed from Kiel for this sole purpose. Yet when Allied intelligence scoured post-war German naval records, no final destination for these freighters was ever entered. Their voyage simply disappears into silence. Survivors' testimonies, scattered across decades, provide haunting fragments. In 1956, a former Kriegsmarine officer, interviewed by West German investigators, recalled standing watch aboard a minesweeper off Gila Peninsula when he saw unmarked steamers, painted grey, escorted at close quarters by submarines. He claimed no civilians were aboard. Instead, he described steel containers, rectangular, uniform, marked with the Reichsadler crest, winched onto decks before departure. He remembered the secrecy orders: no approach, no lights, no signals. Within days, the ships were gone, and no mention of them reached his superiors again. Another testimony comes from a Polish fisherman, recorded in 1962 by local authorities in Gdynia. He told of seeing a distant convoy steaming eastward in late January, despite the general flow of refugee vessels moving west. The ship seemed to vanish into a snow squall and never reappeared. When investigators checked naval weather reports, the dates aligned with a severe Baltic storm on January 30th, precisely when the unmarked convoy would have been at sea. The archival trail is just as enigmatic. In US National Archives holdings, a file labeled Naval Priorities, Baltic Evacuations contains a March 1945 OSS intelligence summary referencing anomalous sailings from Gotenhafen without registry. The report speculated that these were linked to material shipments connected with advanced propulsion research. Another file, this time from the British Admiralty, discusses rumours of special consignments destined not for German ports, but for neutral waters, possibly Sweden, possibly farther. The language is deliberately cautious, suggesting that even those compiling the report were uncertain whether the intelligence was rumour or fact. What could the Reich have been moving so desperately? Theories abound. Some point to the surviving documentation from Peenemünde, which notes the storage of experimental rocket guidance systems, jet turbine prototypes, and radar equipment. Others highlight cryptic references to biologische Materialien in SS correspondence, implying biological agents or research files. A less substantiated but persistent rumor is that gold from the Reichsbank, already known to have been hidden in various alpine lakes, was also loaded aboard the Seeschlange, ships to finance a post-war escape network. The absence of cargo manifests, combined with eyewitness descriptions of sealed containers, ensures that speculation will always outrun confirmation. The Soviet side of the record adds yet another layer of uncertainty. NKVD reports from spring 1945, declassified after 1991, mention missing transports believed to have departed Gotenhafen in January. One such report, dated March 22nd, claims that Soviet submarines engaged enemy supply steamers near Bornholm, sinking at least one. Yet no wreckage has ever been conclusively identified, and Soviet after-action reports are notoriously imprecise. The possibility remains that at least some of the Seeschlange convoy went down in those waters, carrying its cargo to the bottom of the Baltic. In the decades since, divers and salvage teams have repeatedly scoured the seabed. The discovery of the Wilhelm Gustloff and Goya wrecks, refugee ships sunk with catastrophic loss of life, overshadowed quieter searches for smaller, unidentified freighters. Yet scattered sonar readings near the Gulf of Gdansk have shown anomalies consistent with ships resting at unnatural angles, entombed beneath silt. Baltic authorities have largely forbidden deeper investigation, citing the danger of unexploded ordnance and chemical munitions dumped after the war. To this day, rumors circulate of sealed hulls containing not weapons but files, archives of Nazi research that never reached Allied hands. The most unsettling element is how abruptly the paper trail ends. Unlike Operation Paperclip in the United States or the Soviet extractions at Nordhausen, the Seeschlange story has no resolution. The ships neither docked at known German ports nor appear in Allied seizure lists. They simply vanished, as if swallowed by the sea itself. The Allies clearly knew something. They intercepted signals, noted irregular sailings, and recorded whispers of advanced cargo. But the archival record stops short of confirmation. Whether the freighters sank in storms, were intercepted, or reached. Neutral harbors under false identities remains unanswered. Some historians argue the convoy was a mirage, confused sightings amidst the chaos of Hannibal. Yet the persistence of references across British, American, and Soviet files, combined with survivor testimonies, suggests otherwise. The truth may lie rusting on the seabed, sealed in steel containers marked with the Reich's eagle. Until those wrecks are definitively identified and opened, the story of Seeschlange remains locked in its own frozen grave, a ghost convoy adrift in history, lost somewhere between fact and silence in the Baltic winter of 1945. In the ruins of wartime Europe, every neutral capital became a theatre for espionage. Lisbon, Stockholm, Bern, all were crowded with agents, double agents, and couriers. But perhaps no neutral enclave played a more ambiguous role than Vatican City, a sovereign state of barely 110 acres in the heart of Rome. While the Vatican is remembered for diplomacy and humanitarian relief during World War II, files unearthed in the archives of the OSS suggest something far more complex. A communications network hidden beneath the cloak of papal neutrality, transmitting encrypted intelligence across borders under the guise of charity. Known in fragmentary documents as the Vatican Cipher network, it may have been one of the most carefully concealed intelligence pipelines of the war. The first indication appears in an OSS Rome station report dated October 12, 1943, barely weeks after the German occupation of the city. The report, classified secret for directors' eyes only, notes the interception of a courier leaving the Apostolic Palace at dawn. The man carried a satchel marked with the seal of the Papal Secretariat for Refugees. Inside, beneath food, coupons and baptism certificates for displaced children, OSS officers discovered a roll of microfilm wrapped in wax paper. The microfilm contained coded messages in numerical groups, aligned to a cipher system not identified with any Allied or Axis intelligence service. According to the report, the man was quietly released, under protest from ecclesiastical authorities. But the find alarmed OSS analysts enough to initiate surveillance on Vatican couriers. Deeper investigation revealed patterns. Couriers carrying crates of medical supplies or relief documents routinely traveled from Rome to neutral territories such as Switzerland, Spain, and Portugal. While the Vatican had every legitimate reason to operate such missions, OSS files suggest that beneath the humanitarian cargo lay concealed packets of microfilm. A December 1943 decrypt, compiled by the British Government Code and Cipher School, linked the messages to Luftwaffe fuel stock records from airfields in northern Italy. This raised an immediate question. Who was the intended recipient? Were Vatican channels transmitting German military data to the Allies, or smuggling Allied intelligence into Axis hands? The ambiguity remains unresolved even today. Among the most compelling documents in the OSS Rome station files is a series of cipher sheets labeled Cipher Key 47P. Written in Latin script but overlaid with numerical grids, the sheets were discovered in a locked cabinet during a 1944 raid on an abandoned villa outside Frascati. The villa, according to captured German correspondents, had been a temporary radio relay used by elements of the Abwehr, yet the cipher sheets bore Vatican's stationary headers, leading analysts to conclude that at least one channel of papal communication had been penetrated, or willingly shared, with Axis handlers. The cipher itself was never fully broken, but marginalia, in pencil, suggest references to Aurora and Goldener Term, likely codenames for financial shipments or safe houses. Financial intelligence threads weave heavily through the Vatican cipher network. OSS summaries from mid-1944 describe papal couriers transporting sealed ledgers across the Alps to Swiss banks. While Vatican officials insisted these movements concerned only church accounts and refugee funds, intercepted correspondence between Italian industrialists and German embassy staff suggested otherwise. A June 1944 cable from Bern to Berlin referenced Aurora files now secured in Geneva under papal custody. Some historians believe these were inventories of Axis gold reserves, much of it looted from occupied Europe and laundered through neutral financial systems. The Vatican's unique diplomatic immunity provided a perfect cover. No customs officer would dare search the Pope's emissary. The political implications were volatile. Allied commanders feared that public exposure of Vatican involvement, whether voluntary or coerced, would trigger massive diplomatic fallout. A July 1944 memorandum from OSS Chief William Donovan to Roosevelt himself acknowledged the risk. To indict the Holy See as complicit in Axis information channels is to fracture Catholic loyalty across the United States and Europe. Any such disclosure must remain buried, regardless of its veracity. From that point forward, Vatican surveillance files were restricted to a handful of senior officers, stored in what Donovan called the Red Box, a compartment of intelligence so sensitive it bypassed normal filing systems. After Rome's liberation in June 1944, OSS and British SIS intensified their scrutiny of papal couriers. Strangely, the volume of suspicious transmissions increased rather than decreased. Reports detail couriers traveling via Florence and Milan into the neutral Ticino region of Switzerland, often escorted by local clergy. One surviving testimony from a captured Italian telegraph operator claims that ecclesiastical pouches carried maps of German fortifications south of the Gothic Line, later traced to accurate Allied bombardments in late 1944. If true, this suggests that at least part of the Vatican cipher network was indeed feeding intelligence to the Allies under total secrecy, perhaps through unofficial channels beyond papal control. Yet the darker possibilities remain. A post-war debrief of Reinhard Gehlen, former Wehrmacht intelligence chief on the Eastern Front, includes a cryptic reference to the Holy Office channel, through which German agents allegedly received updates on Allied troop movements in Italy. Gehlen insisted these transmissions were the work of compromised couriers within the Vatican network, not official papal policy. Still, the OSS Red Box notes contain at least 2 unexplained disappearances of couriers believed to have defected or been eliminated after accusations of double dealing. When the war ended, the Vatican cipher network quietly dissolved into silence. Unlike the overt Operation Paperclip or the Soviet seizure of German archives, no Allied report ever publicized what was found in papal couriers' satchels. In 1947, an internal State Department memorandum ordered termination of all investigation into Holy See intelligence activities, citing overriding diplomatic necessity. The files were sealed, some destroyed, others buried in intelligence repositories where they remain inaccessible. Vatican archives, still closed to outside researchers for the period after 1939, offer no answers. The fragments we possess, microfilm rolls without origin, cipher sheets with Vatican letterheads, OSS memos thick with redactions, are tantalizing, but incomplete. They paint a picture of a network that may have served multiple masters at once, transmitting German military data to allies, shielding Axis financial flows, and perhaps even feeding selective intelligence back to Berlin. Whether this was sanctioned by the Vatican itself, or whether opportunistic clerics and couriers exploited the cover of neutrality, may never be known. The only certainty is that in the shifting shadows of wartime Rome, even the walls of the Apostolic Palace were not beyond the reach of espionage. What survives today is the ambiguity. The Vatican Cipher network stands not as a resolved case, but as a lingering absence in the record, an archive deliberately thinned, a puzzle missing its core pieces. For intelligence officers of the time, it was both a gift and a danger, a channel, cloaked in sanctity, moving unseen through the heart of war-torn Europe. For historians, it remains a reminder that in World War II, neutrality was rarely absolute, and even the smallest state could harbor the largest secrets. In the late spring of 1945, the Reich collapsed under the weight of its own delusions. But as Allied armies carved up the ruins of Germany, another war was playing out thousands of miles east, in the vast, frozen expanse of Manchuria. When Soviet forces launched their August offensive against Japan's Kwantung Army, they not only crushed one of Tokyo's largest field armies, but also seized assets whose nature remained obscured for decades. Among the scattered fragments of declassified Soviet and American files lies a cryptic designation: Protocol Sibir, the Siberian Transfer Protocol, suggesting that in the chaotic twilight of the Second World War, a clandestine exchange of biological and weapons material between Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan passed directly into Soviet custody. The earliest Allied hint comes from intercepted Japanese diplomatic traffic in February 1945, decrypted by US Navy signals units in Hawaii. The messages, routed from Berlin through Tokyo's embassy in Stockholm, contained veiled references to the frozen vaults and packages bound for the East by rail. At the time, American analysts speculated the codes referred to rare industrial metals. Yet months later, OSS summaries began to note repeated references to biological stores and medical consignments, terminology strikingly out of place in normal industrial traffic. The intercepts stopped abruptly after April 1945, coinciding with Germany's collapse, but not before leaving the unsettling impression of shipments already underway. On the Soviet side, the picture is clearer but darker. NKVD after-action reports from the Manchurian campaign, partially released in the 1990s, describe Red Army troops overrunning several installations linked to Japan's notorious Unit 731. One report dated August 18, 1945, mentions sealed containers of foreign origin discovered in Harbin, guarded by Kwantung Army officers who resisted surrender. These containers were not standard Japanese design. Soviet engineers noted German stenciling on several crates, including the eagle insignia of the Reich. Their contents were never disclosed in the surviving summaries, but the documents indicate immediate transfer under Protocol Sibir, with shipments routed by rail through Irkutsk to secret laboratories east of Novosibirsk. American intelligence caught glimpses of these movements only indirectly. In October 1945, a CIC field report from Tokyo mentions Japanese officers under interrogation who admitted that European partners had assisted in developing plague-resistant rodent colonies for use in biological warfare. The prisoners referenced experiments conducted jointly with German advisors during 1943 in occupied China. Though the claims could not be corroborated, OSS analysts flagged the testimony as consistent with earlier intercepts describing the frozen vaults. Yet by early 1946, all leads went cold. Witnesses disappeared into Soviet custody, and the locations of the alleged transfers vanished from Allied sight. The surviving Soviet files hint at deliberate obfuscation. A classified memorandum to Lavrenti Beria, head of the NKVD, dated September 2, 1945, outlines the establishment of a special research sector under the Third Directorate. The memo states, material of German provenance successfully integrated into Laboratory Number 12, with Japanese methodologies applied under strict quarantine. Laboratory Number 12, located near Sverdlovsk, would later gain infamy during the Cold War as a suspected site of biological weapons research. The memo's explicit linkage of German and Japanese material strongly suggests that Protocol Sibir was not an isolated incident, but a deliberate Soviet effort to fuse Axis research into its own programs. What did these shipments contain? Theories range from advanced chemical agents to frozen cultures of pathogens. A US Army Chemical Corps report from 1947, declassified in part during the 1970s, claimed that Soviet laboratories had gained access to aerosol dispersal techniques, inconsistent with pre-war Russian science, but strikingly similar to concepts studied by both German and Japanese militaries. Another CIA analysis from 1953 speculated that the anomalous spike in Soviet virological capacity post-1945 could only be explained by the acquisition of external material. Both reports reference, without elaboration, Siberian acquisitions of 45. Defectors occasionally shed light, though never enough for certainty. In 1962, a Soviet microbiologist named Grigory M., who escaped through Turkey, told Western debriefers that during his early career, he had worked on German samples from Harbin, stored in sealed ampules. He described them as frozen death, transported in steel, and claimed the materials were handled under constant NKVD supervision. His testimony was dismissed by some as exaggeration, yet it aligned disturbingly with OSS intercepts from 2 decades earlier. Grigory later vanished from public record, reportedly resettled under a new identity in Western Europe, his credibility forever in question. The secrecy surrounding Protocol Sibir was reinforced by the erasure of witnesses. Japanese officers, implicated in biological warfare, who fell into Soviet hands, never stood trial at Tokyo. Unlike their counterparts tried under Allied war crimes tribunals, many simply disappeared. American prosecutors complained of missing files, while Moscow deflected inquiries by claiming the individuals had died in custody. In reality, declassified KGB rosters show that several high-ranking Unit 731 doctors were transferred to Soviet special camps in Siberia, their names redacted from official surrender documents. Their expertise, it seems, was too valuable for public justice. In hindsight, Protocol Sibir fits a broader pattern. Just as the United States launched Operation Paperclip to harvest German rocket and medical expertise, and Britain conducted its own shadow extractions under Operation Eclipse, the Soviet Union conducted its own seizures in Manchuria. Yet the nature of the Siberian transfers, biological, untraceable, and shrouded in euphemism, sets them apart. Unlike rockets or jets, pathogens leave little physical evidence. Once integrated into research programs, their origins are impossible to prove. What remains is the unsettling shadow of knowledge exchanged in the dying days of the Axis, knowledge still hidden within laboratories and archives behind locked doors. Today, the Siberian Transfer Protocol is little more than a handful of redacted reports, stray intercepts, and testimonies from men long dead. No containers have been found, no definitive proof unearthed. The Baltic Sea may hold the ghost convoy of sea Schlange, but in Siberia, the truth lies buried under state secrecy. Yet every fragment suggests the same conclusion. As Germany collapsed and Japan prepared for defeat, their most dangerous legacies were not surrendered or destroyed. They were handed off quietly to an ally of convenience turned future adversary. In August 1945, beneath the banner of victory, a new shadow war had already begun. One carried not by tanks or bombers, but by sealed steel crates moving silently across the endless Siberian steppe. In early April 1945, as the Third Reich teetered on the edge of collapse, units of the US 4th Armored Division advanced through the Thuringian Forest in central Germany. Near the town of Ohrdruf, they stumbled upon what appeared to be another grim discovery in a landscape already littered with atrocities: a subcamp of the Buchenwald concentration camp system. Official histories record that Ohrdruf Nord was the first Nazi concentration camp liberated by American troops, its skeletal survivors and scenes of horror later shown to General Eisenhower himself. But beneath this official narrative lies a darker, largely suppressed story, that adjacent to the camp stood a subterranean complex unlike any other encountered in the Reich, a bunker whose destruction in the weeks that followed erased almost every trace of its existence. Among intelligence files filed under Special Weapons Restricted, the site became known only as the Thuringian Anomaly. The earliest surviving report comes from an after-action summary filed April 9, 1945, by a US Army Corps of Engineers officer, Captain John McClellan. In his typed statement, McClellan describes following local villagers who pointed toward underground workings beyond the camp perimeter. Expecting storage depots, his unit forced open a steel blast door partially concealed by rubble. Beyond lay reinforced concrete corridors leading to chambers lined with heavy machinery. McClellan wrote of industrial-scale generators and circular assemblies resembling reactor shielding, terminology unusual for an engineer untrained in nuclear physics. He emphasized that the dimensions and complexity exceed any known German underground installation encountered thus far. His report was immediately classified. Other accounts, buried in unit diaries, corroborate McClellan's observations. A sergeant with the 89th Infantry Division noted in his pocket journal that strange engines, like nothing I've seen, sat idle in vast halls, humming faintly as if still alive. Another soldier claimed that crates stenciled with the AEG logo, Allgemeine Elektrizitätsgesellschaft, a German electrical giant, stood unopened in the chambers, guarded by SS men who surrendered without a fight. Several POW interrogations mention frantic orders to destroy documents before the Americans breached the tunnels, though little paper evidence was recovered. Within days, the site was cordoned off by Counterintelligence Corps, CIC officers, who ordered all lower-ranking personnel to withdraw. What happened next was shrouded in secrecy. CIC memoranda recovered from National Archives files decades later refer to priority exploitation, Ohrdruf sector, with directives that all photographs and sketches be handed over under penalty of court-martial. Survivors of the 4th Armored recall military photographers taking extensive images of the bunker's interior, yet none have surfaced publicly. The few blurry snapshots preserved in personal collections show only nondescript concrete corridors. Eisenhower's April 12th visit to Ohrdruf is well documented. He toured the concentration camp, but no official itinerary mentions the subterranean site, despite testimonies suggesting he was briefed privately about it. The most chilling clue lies in an OSS cable dated April 18, 1945, marked Eyes Only. It references preliminary assessments of atomic research material at Ohrdruf and recommends immediate consultation with Manhattan Engineer District personnel. At the time, the Manhattan Project was still cloaked in the highest secrecy, and the idea of Nazi nuclear progress was hotly debated. The cable's phrasing, atomic research material, was deliberately vague, but its urgency is unmistakable. Within a week, demolition teams from the US Army had rigged the complex with explosives. On April 25, 1945, according to Combat Engineers' logs, the entire site was detonated, collapsing the tunnels into a mangled ruin. Officially, the demolition was described as rendering the camp's underground facilities unusable. Unofficially, it obliterated any chance of independent verification. After the war, questions surfaced sporadically. In 1947, a British intelligence officer submitted a memorandum noting persistent German claims of nuclear experimentation in the Thuringen forest, but the report was quietly shelved. Soviet occupation authorities, upon securing Thuringia later that year, launched their own excavation of the Ohrdruf site. A declassified GRU field report from 1948 complains bitterly that the Americans have removed all technical material of significance, remaining debris unfit for analysis. Soviet suspicion that the US had seized critical technology from Ohrdruf became a recurring theme in Cold War propaganda, though Western officials dismissed the charges as exaggeration. The witness testimonies, however, never fully disappeared. Local villagers interviewed in the 1950s spoke of trainloads of machinery arriving in Ohrdruf throughout 1944, guarded by SS technical battalions. They recalled forced laborers digging tunnels day and night under horrific conditions. Several claimed that in the winter of 1945, strange illnesses spread among prisoners working underground, symptoms consistent with radiation exposure, though no medical files survive. In the 1980s, when East German researchers attempted to re-examine the site, they found only collapsed shafts sealed with concrete and rebar. Officially, they attributed the illness rumors to typhus, but internal Stasi memoranda noted anomalous geological readings near the ruins. The few surviving US documents on Ohrdruf remain heavily redacted. A 1952 Atomic Energy Commission note refers to Ohrdruf case materials filed under special weapons, restricted, no public dissemination. Another CIA briefing from 1960, reviewing Soviet nuclear capabilities, lists Ohrdruf Anomaly 45 as a possible source of German technical input, an acknowledgement that, at least within intelligence circles, the site was remembered. Yet, despite decades of speculation, no definitive evidence has emerged to prove what the bunker housed: nuclear prototypes, experimental reactors, or something more mundane but politically inconvenient. What is certain is that the site's deliberate. Ohrdruf was unique. Other Nazi underground complexes, such as Mittelwerk at Nordhausen or the secret facilities at Jonestal, were documented extensively and later studied by Allied and Soviet teams. Ohrdruf, by contrast, was not preserved, not studied, but obliterated. Its destruction ensured that only fragments, soldier testimonies, stray reports, redacted cables remain. This pattern of suppression suggests that whatever lay beneath the Thuringian forest in April 1945 was considered too sensitive to risk exposure, even decades later. The silent bunker at Ohrdruf thus occupies a liminal place in the history of World War II. It is simultaneously one of the most well-attested and most elusive of the Reich's secret sites. Seen by dozens of men, recorded in classified files, yet scrubbed from the public record almost as soon as it was discovered. To the soldiers who first entered, it was a place of incomprehensible machinery and eerie silence. To the intelligence officers who sealed it, it was a liability too dangerous to acknowledge. And to history, it remains an empty crater of speculation, an erased chapter in the closing days of the war, buried beneath rubble and silence, where the truth was detonated along with the concrete walls that once held it. The records end not with answers, but with erasures. What remains are ash-marked memos, blurred photographs, and testimonies half swallowed by fear. Each clue points toward a history rewritten before it could be read, a battlefield where truth itself was the first casualty. And though the vault doors remain locked, their silence still resounds, reminding us that the most dangerous secrets are not the ones we find, but the ones buried so deep we were never supposed to know they were. There,